Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at the Crusades, a military expedition that was wrought with impact both locally in Western Europe, internationally across Asia Minor, and having social and cultural impacts that we're going to see that will impact both for about the next 700 years. So with that being said, let's get started taking a look at the Crusades. Before we get started with the conflict itself, it's important to make note of where all this is happening, and most notably, it's the city of Jerusalem. Now, this had been the holy city of all three Abrahamic religions since Judaism had gotten started. For Jews, it was where King David's temple was. It's where the Wailing Wall is still, and it's if you ever see pictures of Jerusalem and Orthodox Jews bowing towards a wall, that's the last remnants of said temple. For Christians, this is where the Christian Messiah Jesus lived, where he preached and ultimately was crucified. For Muslims, this is where their leader Muhammad ascended into heaven. The city's holy to all three of them for very different reasons. And even though each Abrahamic religion came in and built on top of the holy city, doesn't mean that it was less holy or more holy to a different group. It's considered holy to all three. It's a really interesting city because you've got the old holy sites next to the new developing state, and all of this is happening at the same time. In this picture you can see the building that is most iconically holy to all three, the Dome of the Rock. That is the gold domed object in about the central part of the screen. All three Abrahamic religions believe this is where Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son in Judaism, and it would be picked up again in Christianity and then again in Islam. By the 11th century, Islam was a place that all three of the Abrahamic religions were living in, worshiping in, traveling towards. The Seljuk Turks had control of the city, and until 1071 they allowed anyone to come and go, just so long as if you were a person of the book, a dahimi, that you pay the tax that Muslims installed on this. And this was not an unrealistic thing, and this wasn't even uncommon for Christians to do, or Western Europeans to do, especially if you were traveling through another country to a holy site. So that wasn't uncommon. But in 1071, the Turks are going to stop allowing Christian visitors to come to Jerusalem at all. And this was primarily because a group of Christians had acted a fool, as we would say today in the 21st century. And this had been a prolonged problem for quite some time. And the Turks felt that the best way to deal with this problem was to ban all Christians from coming to the city from this point forward. And this was not a very popular decision. We see that Pope Gregory VII had been planning ideas of conflict and using the church for conflict for quite some time. Initially, Pope Gregory wanted to use the power of the church to reunite all of Christianity after the Great Schism, bringing both the Roman and Greek churches back together. But Gregory dies before he can really pull this off. Even though Gregory dies and this kind of idea kind of dies with him, it shows that the church was willing to use their military forces to achieve a tangible ends. In 1095, as the Seljuk Turks are expanding against the Byzantine Empire, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Alexius I, is going to ask the Pope of Rome for help. And this is really unprecedented. Byzantium and Rome had not been good friends for quite some time, definitely since the Great Schism, and this is going to be a real indicator of how bad things are, that Constantinople is going to ask for help from an enemy that they absolutely do not like. When Urban receives this letter, he says, essentially, and I'm paraphrasing a lot here, that yes, of course, we'll help you. We will send an army to help you by fighting Jerusalem. And this is quite a surprise because This map you can see geographically where everything is. Rome located in central Italy, as you can tell, Constantinople on the Black Sea in what is now Turkey, and Jerusalem on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. It's a long way off. Alexius was asking for help in Turkey, and Urban sends help to Turkey, to Constantinople, to the Byzantine Empire, but with the belief that liberating, quote unquote, Jerusalem would be the ultimate goal. There were a variety of real goals of the Crusades. There was obviously the economic one, that if you were going to claim a whole bunch of land for yourself, you're going to get a whole lot of money real quick. And larger than that was taking the trade routes back from Arab Muslims. Muslims had been in control of these trade routes, specifically those ending near the Silk Road ones ending in the Eastern Mediterranean, for about the last 3 centuries. And there's a lot of money that you can make on this. Socially speaking, if you were a feudal kid, and the feudal system of Western Europe at this time, you traditionally might get a decent inheritance when dad dies, but if you're a younger son, or if there's 4 or 5 kids in front of you, you might not get a lot. This was an opportunity for you to show, what you're made of, to go out there and stake a claim for yourself. Politically, this was going to hopefully fix a lot of instability within Western Europe. Get some anger and aggressions out on some people who are not Western Europeaners. Religiously, of course, there's the idea of fighting for the name of your faith. And when we see all these put together, there's a big push for these crusades that are going to start to take place. Larger than that is what the Pope offers. He says that if you go and fight and die, you go straight to heaven. In the Crusades, you can do whatever you want. You can lie, cheat, steal, kill, all those really big things that are against typical Christian moral ethic codes. And not only would you suffer no sins for this, but all sins would be automatically forgiven. There's not even a punishment for the sin itself. So for a lot of the people who are looking for both a tangible as well as a spiritual idea of what to do next, this cemented the idea. Now, a lot of these crusaders are going to be these big, heavily armed, very well off knights, but that doesn't mean that they're the only people who go to. There's Peter's army too, commonly referred to as the other crusading army. Peter was a hermit. He was an average guy who had a real way with words, a real way with people, and over time, as this is going on, he starts creating his own little, there's really no nice way to say it, mob of people who want to go and fight, specifically because they believe things in Europe are really, really bad, and if they go to Jerusalem, things will be so much better. It's worth pointing out that most of these people are peasants. They are not soldiers, they're not devout, they're not superly trained to fight, so as they are marching, we see a very common clash between the army that the Byzantines are hoping to show up and the army that actually shows up. Even if this army gets to Byzantium, they're terrible. They're a mob. They attack, they steal things that they think are important. At some point, they try to fight the Turks. That ultimately ends very poorly. When the Byzantines force Peter's army out of Constantinople, Peter's army will very soon meet a group of Turks. They try to fight, and then Peter's army is pretty much crushed, and the other army is allocated to a footnote in history. There's a lot of different ways that Crusaders were getting from Western Europe to Jerusalem, and it's worth pointing out that going by water was the better way to go because it was faster, because you could avoid all those rigorous mountains and crossing through lands, and oh no, I don't have a horse. Well, that's okay, jump on a boat. And a lot of these crusaders are going to start heading out of Genoa, Marseille, but most infamously Venice. And keep an eye on that last part when we get a little further along. The plan initially was, well, kind of crazy, because as crusaders start arriving in Constantinople and start fighting the Turks there, Emperor Alexius says, this is great, this is just what I wanted, but then starts making the crusaders swear oaths of loyalty to him. In exchange, they get to carve out these giant crusading states, and these crusading states, some of them are going to be large enough that we would call them nation states. The First Crusade was a calamity for a lot of different reasons. First off, there was no real plan. The first plan was everybody meet in Constantinople, then everybody go to Jerusalem, then everybody fight, then we all win. And the Crusaders were really ill-prepared for this war. They didn't know the climate, they didn't know the geography, they didn't know the culture, there was no specific strategy, they didn't have a real leader, and they come from all across Western Europe with their own languages, cultures, backgrounds, ideas, ideals, and they clash with each other just as much as they're clashing with their enemies. In 1099, the siege of Jerusalem begins. It lasts for about a month when 12,000 soldiers take the city and ultimately win the day. And this is really a surprising victory when we look back on it. And it was the success that the Crusades had been built up to be, that a marauding group of Christians could successfully attack another foreign power and, in a religious sense, win. The aftermath of this, though, is not so successful, because even though the First Crusaders did take this city, most of them immediately went back to Europe. And once this happens, Jerusalem is going to very quickly fall to Muslim forces who attack the city, now that no one's there to defend it. Now, it's worth pointing out that's not nobody, but the number of people who stay to defend is so very small that the Muslim forces who do reattack and will take the city, well, it's no surprise that they win very easily. And once Jerusalem falls, there's a lot of different ways that Crusaders were getting from Western Europe to Jerusalem. The Second Crusading attempt was another attempt to reconquer Jerusalem after it had fallen again. It takes place about a century later, and it ends in total failure. It didn't have the numbers, it didn't have the effort, it didn't have the support back in Western Europe, and it also helped that the city is heavily captured and held by Muslim forces who were really good. The Crusaders from Western Europe thought, hey, we did this so easily the first time, we don't have to even try that hard the second time. So the Second Crusade is not as successful as some would have expected it to be. The Third Crusade, I like to say, is kind of like the rock star crusade of Western Europe, because you've got a major host, a giant army that goes to fight, most notably including some of the greatest monarchs and most powerful monarchs that were in Western Europe at this time. Phillip of France, Frederick of Germany, Richard of England. But despite the fact that your king is leading you and you've got so much to prove, and there's still the spiritual, political, cultural ramifications of all this, the Third Crusade ended with a disaster. For England especially, Richard was captured, and then the British had to spend a tremendous amount of money to free him from his ransom, and Richard then gets home and dies just a few years after that. So the Third Crusade, and even its impacts, were really pretty negative. It's not the last crusade. The last crusade worth mentioning is the Fourth Crusade. This takes place in 1204, when the Venetians, who, like I said earlier, Venice and Constantinople didn't always like each other very much. Constantinople was the big trading force in Eastern Europe. It was on the connecting path to Alexandria, so it was picking up a lot of the landed wealth, and Venice wanted to be the big trading merchants force. So Venice is going to use their ships, which they had been using to move soldiers across the Mediterranean, to instead move the soldiers to attack Constantinople and then install their own leadership there. And once this was all said and done, the surprise, surprise, Jerusalem is still held by the Muslims, and this was a total disaster in every way, shape, and form that it could have ever been. There's more crusades that followed after this, but they get worse and worse and much less successful. So by and large, this is really the end of our crusading idea. But we do have effects of the crusades, and even though the Christians don't win, they are very successful in their impacts, in the effects of the crusades. Most notably is the stuff from ancient Greece had started to return to Europe because of the Crusades. The Muslim scholars had held on to a lot of these books and texts and scrolls and stuff from the ancient Greeks, from antiquity, and as Europeans are, pillaging a large part of the Muslim states, they start finding old copies of this, and they start bringing them back. We also start to see they're going to start bringing back items and goods, manufactured paper, sugar, glass, coffee, tobacco. These are things that were not very common and were certainly luxury items in Western Europe. But now they're coming back easily and cheap for everything. And there's a short list here of the kind of stuff that people are bringing back from Western Europe. And this idea is really indicative of what we're going to see happen. I mean, even though the Crusades were a total wash as far as military victories for the Crusaders, it did lead to the idea of wanting more of this stuff. And this led Western Europe to start wanting to expand more, which will lead to the Age of Exploration. Mind you, we're still a few centuries away from our big discoveries, like, how to get to India by waterways, or Columbus's "I wonder if I can sail west and get east" ideas. So the Crusades ultimately were a really complicated collection of military campaigns that, even though they didn't end very well, were very important in how they helped shape Europe, specifically on accordance to social, political interactions with the environment, culture, and economics. So that's about everything worth talking about for the Crusades. This is just a general overview, and I know I missed a lot of stuff, but I hope you walked away with something you can use, and I'll see y'all later.